I'll pass on to Lisa to introduce the first speaker.
Thanks, Marty. Welcome back. Today we're covering distributed energy resources at all levels of the electricity system, at the distribution system level and at the bulk power system level. Our presenters are returning from previous sessions with you. So Sean Murphy, again, is a department assistant leader whose research spans energy efficiency, demand flexibility, and loads in buildings. He's got some utility experience in National Lab. He holds a master's in environmental engineering and a master of public policy. And JP Carballo is a research scientist whose research focuses on long-term power system planning, as well as integrating and planning for distributed resources in electric vehicles, with also has a very strong focus on reliability and resilience valuation. JP has a PhD and master's degrees in energy resources, as well as engineering degrees from Chile. And again, we really do hope that you ask questions or make comments. Feel free to use the chat box. You can chat me privately if you want, or chat to everyone so everybody can see your question or comment. And feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you. All right, Sean?
All right, thank you, Lisa. And hello, everyone. I'm just going to queue up our slide deck. All right, so thank you everyone for being here today. And today I'll be talking about the distribution system side of how distributed energy resources are fit into electricity planning before JP takes over. Great. So I first just want to sort of situate ourselves in the electric power system. I'll be talking about where distributed energy resources, or DERs, as I'll be referring to them throughout the presentation, fit into distribution system planning. So the distribution system is this part of the power system demarcated by the blue box here. It's the part of the power system that you're most likely to see on a daily basis. It begins at a substation that takes in high voltage electricity from the transmission system, and then brings that down to lower voltage electricity that is then distributed into our households and local businesses. So if you're driving around, walking around, and you see overhead lines, that's the distribution system. So just a quick overview of what we'll be covering in this part of the presentation today. I'm going to offer a definition of distributed energy resources, DERs, and provide a little bit more detail about what distribution system planning means. I'll then walk through a few key topics that in distribution system planning and how DERs fall into that. So that includes DER forecasting and hosting capacity analysis. And then we'll talk about how DERs can provide grid services or services to the distribution system specifically, and how utilities are able to operationalize those services to address needs in the distribution system. So what are DERs? They can be a range of energy assets that are sited close to utility customers, and they can provide all or some of the facility's energy needs and can support the power system by reducing peak demand, providing energy, capacity, and ancillary services to the grid. We'll come back to some of those grid services later. DERs can be in front of the meter, so that could be a utility battery at a substation, or they can be behind the meter, such as rooftop solar. And when I'm saying meter here, I'm thinking about the utility meter. That's sort of the interface between a building or a facility and the grid itself. So DERs include a wide range of technologies. So they include, but are not limited to, this list I have here. So we have demand response. So that can include both sort of programmatic efforts to reduce peak demand, that when a utility is sending a signal to a customer, can also include time varying rates that incentivize reductions in demand during peak periods. And DERs also include energy efficiency improvements that sort of reduce load sort of passively, as we refer to, sort of in all hours that the device might be operating. So an Example there could be an efficient HVAC system that just reduces the electricity consumption required to sort of cool a home. And also gas and diesel generators, often used during power outages, are considered DERs. Rooftop solar and community solar, battery storage, as well as microgrids. So this is a diverse array of technologies. They can do many things within the distribution system, and we're going to touch on some of those details as we move through the presentation. So we've covered sort of what DERs are, and I've talked about distribution system planning generally, but I want to give a little bit more detail about what I'm referring to when I say distribution system planning. Simply put, it's the process that utilities undertake to plan for operations and investments that maintain the safe, reliable delivery of power and sort of meet other planning objectives in the distribution system. All utilities conduct distribution system planning. However, not all do so through formal regulatory processes. So this figure here comes from a recent Berkeley Lab project where we looked at the state requirements for distribution system planning. Each of these circles is showing the type of utility process that states use to address distribution system planning. And each color corresponds to a different type of planning process. And you'll notice in some states, such as Minnesota, Pennsylvania, there's a few different colors there. That just indicates that some states have multiple processes that are informing distribution system planning. States that lack a colored circle still have distribution system planning. It's just occurring through just utility processes and not through a formal regulatory process. So now I'm going to talk about forecasting DERs and how that fits into a pretty fundamental utility planning process of load forecasting. First, I just want to sort of offer a definition of load forecasting. Peak demand on different parts of the distribution system often drives or can drive, among other things, decisions to invest in new infrastructure. And when peak demand gets close to or is exceeding, say, the ratings of existing infrastructure, it might be necessary to make upgrades to deliver safe power. To actually plan for these investments, though, utilities need to estimate peak demand in future years. So utilities accomplish this through load forecasting. It's the process by which utilities estimate peak demand at specific locations on the distribution system to inform the timing, the need, and the type of distribution system investments. For distribution system planning, this forecasting usually occurs on a 5 to maybe 10, 15 year time frame. And utilities they start this process by first estimating what we call gross load. That's based on a historical relationship between load, weather, economic data, demographic variables. And gross load forecasts do not account for the weather-dependent impacts or weather-dependent DERs, such as rooftop solar, nor do they account for energy efficiency or demand response. It's just relating historical peaks and factors that explain them and trying to project those into the future. Utilities can then consider the impact of load modifying resources such as DERs to produce net forecasts and in this step, it includes counting for changes in customer usage. So an example would be you have EV charging load, increasing load on transformers. Distribution level forecasts can directly inform investment decisions. So if a forecast indicates that peak demand will be significantly higher in 5 years, it may lead to a determination that higher capacity transformer is necessary. So as DER adoption is increasing, utilities do need to be better able to understand their impacts on the distribution system and know how to properly plan for them. Not all distribution networks are going to do this, or different feeders are going to have different forecast outcomes. The peaks may occur at different times depending on whether a distribution feeder is servicing residential buildings or commercial buildings. So there's this diversity across the utility's footprint within the distribution system. And the process of forecasting can identify, how those investments are going to respond to that sort of diversity of load. And distribution load forecasts also inform some other important distribution planning activities, including host and capacity analysis, which we'll touch on later. And they also can inform the sourcing of DER grid services, which we'll also address. So if you're trying to estimate the impact of DERs in the future on peak demand, you can think about there are two different things you're trying to figure out. Trying to figure out how many DERs, say for example, we're just going to use rooftop solar as a useful example. How much rooftop solar will there be in the future? And then how does rooftop solar, like, what is the load shape of that? How does that impact load itself? So first, I'm just going to cover the first question of, how do you measure or estimate the adoption of DERs into the future? Um, so there's inherent uncertainty in estimating the number of DERs in the different types that there'll be in the future. So utilities are trying to make informed estimates of what they think is likely to happen in the future. Utilities can estimate system-wide DER adoption based on existing state targets or requirements. There may be statutory guidance saying we expect to have this much demand response in 2030, and state utilities can use that as a reference point and sort of plan for that to occur. Utilities can also attempt to sort of estimate expected market-based adoption of DERs. It's not just policies that promote adoption. People are installing these technologies of their own volition. So utilities sometimes use diffusion models, which sort of provides a mathematical way of estimating new adopters, early adopters, and late adopters to give a sense of when a new technology may sort of reach a larger level of adoption. Utilities can then allocate that system-wide adoption, so that's across the entire utility service territory basically, to individual feeders based on maybe just the number of customers on a feeder proportional to statewide values. So if we imagine that there's going to be 100 megawatts of solar and there's 100 feeders, we might simply just assume there's 1 megawatt per feeder. Alternatively, utilities can try to map that system-wide adoption level to individual distribution system feeders based on the likelihood that those technologies would be installed in a particular geographic area. The technique that utilities often use here is using something called a propensity model that is relating sort of the likelihood of adoption based on different data and trying to map that. So if there's already a bunch of batteries installed in one feeder, it might stand to reason that you'd expect them to continue to be installed in that location as opposed to a place where there are no batteries right now. So this example I have to the right comes from National Grid New York's 2025 distribution system plan. And the figure is showing their estimate of statewide adoption for photovoltaic rooftop or solar across both residential, commercial, and industrial customers. And it's going out to 2050, even though some of the distribution planning activities are sort of on a shorter time frame. They base their system-wide numbers on a combination of things. They have historical interconnection data that's giving them indicators of where things are already being installed. And they also have state-level targets. They're assuming sort of achievement of that state-level goal. And the utility then estimates the feeder level adoption based on the existing interconnection queue. So that's where people have been applying to interconnect their PV, and they have a sense of it's going to be on certain feeders in the next year or so. And then a model, the propensity model, that's relating socioeconomic data, energy data, the historical patterns of PV deployment to try to estimate those areas where it's more likely that PV is going to be installed. And it does that such that it still achieves the state target across all of the feeders, just recognizing that there are some sort of trends that they've already observed, and they're trying to realize that in their projections of future adoption. So now that we have some estimate of adoption in the future, the next step is trying to understand how are these DRs going to operate? What is their impact in terms of the demand reductions, the amount of load that's generated or consumption over the course of the day? For each DER, there is a range of parameters that could affect and define its operation. As I mentioned, there's a range of technologies here that each have their own nuances. So sometimes the specifics of how you're assuming those technologies operate are going to affect how much demand they bring to the grid, how much they might be able to reduce during peak periods, and so on. So if we take the example of managed electric vehicle charging, there's a number of different sort of parameters that a utility may need to consider in order to develop this forecast of how it's going to operate in the future. These are the examples I have here are a few, but it's not the full list. So they include sort of the type of electric vehicle, the number of vehicle miles traveled, and the efficiency of the vehicle. All of that informs just how much charging need there is overall. Um, there's also the ambient temperature actually has an impact because the charging of the EV battery is less efficient at really cold temperatures and at really warm temperatures. The hours in which charging is managed has a big impact. That could lead to whether the charging is occurring in the evening or in the morning. And related to that is that the stated objective of managed EV charging. Are you trying to minimize evening peak demand, say in the summer when people are turning on their ACs to try to stay cool? That might be what's happening at the bulk power system level, but at the distribution level, things may be slightly different. Another potential is that the charging strategy may be trying to minimize peaks within the distribution system or minimizing customer costs. So all these parameters can inform what charging load shapes look like and have a big impact on what the eventual forecast look like. So this is
Would you go back one slide? We've got a question.
sure.
It's a good question. Can you please explain the delineation between the 10-year forecast and demand assessment on the graph? Wouldn't the planner want to consider both the forecast and the demand regardless of the year?
Yes, so I think this partly relates to National Grid's terminology internally within its report. So I think the 10-year forecast is based on that's what they might be using for the distribution system planning. And then they have these longer term projections of what they expect adoption to be like. So I think, or I recall from the study is that the 10-year forecast is they're using it for the distribution system planning, but the regulators wanted them just kind of extend that analysis and just look a little bit further out. Some of those PV adoption targets that I mentioned had targets both for 2030, 2040, and 2050. So it's just sort of a completion of that, the forecasting exercise, even though it's out in a time frame that they're not making specific decisions right now. It's just sort of preparing them to do so and giving everyone in the distribution planning process a sense of where adoption may be going. All right. So as I was saying, this figure to the right comes from Xcel Energy Minnesota's 2023 integrated grid plan, and it shows their sort of assumed load shape for managed EV charging. And they make a whole host or make some assumptions that lead to this. And it is, if you look at the sort of the shape of it, the peak usage is pretty late into the night. They're assuming that the managed charging is moving away from, say, that 5 to 6 p.m. summer day where you may have a lot of air conditioning load. They're trying to intentionally move the load into the middle of the night and out of early mornings. So the sort of assumptions I mentioned about the charging strategy and the hours in which everything's managed can have a big impact because if you move that load 5 hours earlier, you may have a very different outcome on your distribution system. And just quickly on batteries, I have just another quick example of how this may play out. People may install batteries for different purposes. So there may be different sort of objectives for the charging and discharging that you could assume in one of these forecasts. So customers may be using the batteries just to minimize their own costs, or they may be trying to maximize backup power, both of which could have different sort of charging and discharging load shapes and eventually lead to different impacts on the distribution forecast. I think the key takeaway here is just there are many technical assumptions that a utility can make that could have an impact on the forecasts, and it can be worthwhile to sort of understand them and investigate them and have clarity on what decisions the utility is making in a forecast to understand some of their implications. So when I introduced the gross load forecast earlier, I mentioned that's largely just focused on estimating future peaks. But when we're talking about all these DERs, we need to look at more than just a single hour in which the historical peak occurs. DERs can modify the entire load shape of a building and have an impact on the entire load shape of the feeders themselves. Rooftop PV can also lower like sort of the minimum demand that we see in a year, and can also change the timing of the sort of net peak demand by pushing out later into the day. And DER, such as batteries and demand response, can reduce peak. So we have all these different potential impacts pushing and shaping what the load shape of a feeder may look like. Um, and as we have more DERs operating in the distribution system, and it's important to understand how all this is going to change sort of on an hourly basis to really understand the timing and the magnitude of peak demand changes. Um, so in particular, hourly load shapes can be helpful for identifying potential constraints in the distribution system. When load remains at really high levels for extended periods of time, you might create a thermal risk in some distribution system equipment. You can't identify these with just a single hour load. You might need to understand what load looks like on a 2, 6, 10-hour time frame. But an hourly load shape or a projected DER load is going to be able to help you with that. And given these different changes and pushing and shaping the load shape, having the DER load shapes on an hourly basis can help you understand how those peaks are going to change over time. Because it might be that they start occurring at different times of the day and potentially even different times of the year. So hourly DER load shapes can be based on both modeled and empirical data. There are a host of tools out there, and I've listed a few ones that we've used ourselves for some work, and I've seen utilities use in their own distribution system plans. So the National Renewable Energy Lab has developed a few of these. They include EVI Pro and Pro Lite, which can be used for um, managed EV charging and just general EV network planning. There's ResStock and Comstock, which provide end-use load shapes of buildings. So you can use that to model the impacts of energy efficiency. And then PV Watts allows you to model the generation profiles of solar photovoltaics, and potentially, I think, batteries as well. And utilities can also use measured data from their own programs. So if they run a demand response program, they can measure that impact and have a sense of what that impact will be in the future. And utilities may also use these sort of comprehensive software systems such as LoadSeer that have sort of embedded load shape assumptions for DERs and allow them to sort of use the software as part of a broader forecasting process. So I sometimes see LoadSeer referenced in distribution system plans. There's some other software tools around as well. So these might be things you encounter in filings from utilities. And now I just want to we've been talking in the abstract about some of these load profiles. So I wanted to provide an example of what this can look like in the distribution system planning context. So again, we have an example from National Grid, New York's recent plan. Each subplot here shows the hourly load shape of peak demand for different 5-year time steps in their forecast through 2050. So the lines each represent different combinations of what they call base load. That's in blue. That's the equivalent of the gross load forecast that I mentioned earlier, and then different combinations of DERs. So as I mentioned, the blue load is like the gross load forecast. And I'll just note it has this strong sort of late afternoon, evening peak. This is the summer peak day. So that's heavily driven by cooling loads. And then the orange load shows the net load after accounting for energy efficiency, rooftop photovoltaics, energy storage, and demand response. And I think the difference is most clear in the bottom right for 2050. And you'll see it's significantly lower than the blue load. That's the combination of the DERs, in particular rooftop solar in the middle of the day. So you have this large reduction in net demand. And also the peak is occurring at a different time. It's occurring a little bit later in the evening. So that's the cumulative impact of all of the DERs in the forecast. You have a very different picture of what load will look like in the future. And by having these hourly profiles, you can see how things are shifting across the day. Which is both really interesting to look at and can inform different utility decisions. So as I mentioned earlier, there's just inherent uncertainty in developing a forecast. And unfortunately, there's no perfect way to know how many DERs are going to be on the system in the future, nor how are they going to operate. If that were the case, regulators and utilities will have a much easier job of making decisions about the distribution system planning process. But of course, we don't know all that information, and it's just inherent in the forecasting that you have to manage uncertainty somehow. Utilities can manage this uncertainty in their forecasts through both scenario analysis and different probabilistic methods. The table I have here is from Hawaiian Electric's Integrated Grid Plan from 2023. It shows some key assumptions that differentiate 9 discrete scenarios that they developed. These parameters include, but aren't limited to, the level of DER adoption and the use of managed charging and time-sensitive rates. So these scenarios can help set bounds on the impacts of DERs in the forecast and help understand the potential range of impacts. Of course, when you have 9 different scenarios, there is some challenge in trying to understand, well, which one to focus on. And one way of sort of managing that sort of potential complexity from having many scenarios is using probabilistic methods. So National Grid, New York again, has a good example here. They consider the probability of different DER adoption scenarios. They may have, say, a 25% chance of very high battery adoption, 50% chance of medium adoption, 25% of low. And then what they produce or use in some of their final analyses is sort of a weighted average of those. And by sort of consolidating things into that single weighted average, they're able to sort of simplify the interpretation of the forecasts and then sort of produce sort of like a plus or minus X% sort of estimate of the error, which can help just with the interpretation and giving you a sense of what's more likely, while also still giving you a sense of the sort of the bounds. And one challenge here, as of course, is you have to set those probabilities. So there are some assumptions that are required to construct that probabilistic approach. So that's it for load forecasting. As I mentioned earlier, it can be an important input into this process of hosting capacity analysis. So hosting capacity is the amount of DERs that we can interconnect at a specific point on the distribution grid without either infrastructure upgrades or adversely impacting the power quality or reliability under the control and protection systems currently on the grid. Hosting capacity analysis is the process through which the utility determines that hosting capacity. It's a really important input into key decisions in DER and developing DERs and siting them on the grid. So DER developers will use hosting capacity to determine how large, say, a PV system would be, or sizing a battery, figuring out where it should go on the distribution system, and also how to operate it. Most often, hosting capacity comes up in the context of generation, in particular, distributed PV, but it's not limited. It's not restricted to that. Like there are hosting capacity values that utilities can produce that are specific to adding new loads, as well as storage as well. Utilities often report hosting capacity in maps. So I have an example here to the right from Xcel Energy, Colorado. And they have a website that allows you to sort of zoom in to an area of interest within their service territory and click on individual feeders and then you get these pop-up windows that tell you the hosting capacity and a whole host of other information about the distribution grid in that area. So these maps are pretty common, though utilities may also provide hosting capacity data in downloadable spreadsheets or even through APIs. So I have a link here to Con Edison, the New York utilities, for a leading example of providing data through the APIs, which can really expedite things for developers as well, as they're able to get refreshed information and incorporate it into their own processes quite quickly. The Excel map provides specific information on feeders, but other utilities may report just sort of higher level heat maps in which you may just have a large swash of color that indicates kind of a broad range of hosting capacity in an area. The colors in the Excel map do relate to the amount of a hosting capacity, but it's all just much more geographically granular. The pop-up bar here next to the map includes more information than just the hosting capacity. It includes information on sort of attributes of the distribution system. So I think we see the phase and voltage of lines. There's information on the transformers as well. All of that information can also be really helpful for the development of or installing DERs. So even before host and capacity analyses are produced, knowing this information can be just first steps for utility in making information public, and DER developers can still leverage them to make more informed decisions about where to site DERs, how to operate them, and so on. So here I just want to review some leading practices across states in hosting capacity analysis. So first, utilities can document and make transparent to regulators and developers as well the types of constraints that they're considering for hosting capacity. There are sort of physical characteristics of the distribution system that can mean that limit the amount of DERs that you can provide. So this is really breaking that down and providing the specifics of how the utility is making that determination. So this table on the right comes from Xcel Energy Minnesota's 2024 hosting capacity guidebook, and it identifies a few different categories of those constraints. They can include voltage issues, thermal issues, as I mentioned earlier. Those loads for a sustained period can sort of heat up parts of the distribution system, as well as different protection issues. So for each of these different constraints, there are threshold values, technical limits that indicate that the system can't handle more DERs. Utilities can also report and share that information, which gives that transparency, can help regulators understand utility processes and have sort of validate them, and it helps DER developers sort of understand how to make more informed decisions about citing those DERs. Given any of these constraints, utilities can also report how they plan to mitigate those constraints and provide cost estimates for those. That again can help regulators make decisions about how to sort of advance or promote or increase the amount of hosting capacity on the distribution system. And finally, making the hosting capacity maps and all the data therein publicly available and as granular as possible can go a long way to help developers make decisions about where DERs go and how to operate them, and help regulators make decisions and inform their processes as well. So now I'm going to talk about distribution level grid services. We've talked about what DERs are, talked about how to forecast their impact on peak demand, and how we can determine the amount of DERs that can sort of safely interconnect with the system. So now we'll talk about how these DERs can actually provide services to the distribution system. There's 4 different categories of grid services that I'm going to talk about here. The first is capacity. Capacity is referring to the size, say in kW or megawatts, of distribution system infrastructure like substation transformers. When peak demand reaches close to the rated capacity of the infrastructure, upgrades may be necessary, as we were talking about in the forecasting section. DERs can provide distribution capacity by managing the load on the piece of infrastructure in question. So by reducing peak demand on a feeder, you might be able to potentially delay or avoid the need for an upgrade to parts of the distribution system. So that's the distribution capacity. Of these 4, this is the most common and sometimes the highest value grid service that DERs can provide. DERs can also provide voltage management. So distribution voltage is supposed to stay within an acceptable range that's defined by national standards. Some DERs can help maintain these voltage levels and avoid under or over voltage, which can have adverse effects on electrical equipment and their operations. DERs can also support power reliability by providing energy during system outages. So an example here is having a generator or battery storage during a big storm. If lines go down but a home has a DER, that can provide the energy they need to maintain thermal comfort, keep food cold in the refrigerator, and basically keep some basic services running. So that's the reliability benefit. And finally, power quality. DERs can help limit power harmonics and voltage fluctuations. that can cause things like a flicker. So if you've ever been in a room and the lights just sort of flickered for a couple of seconds, that's maybe a sign of a voltage fluctuation in the distribution system. But DERs can help mitigate all that. So we have our DERs. We know they can provide these services. Now the question is, how does a utility procure them? How do we operationalize all of these things and make sure we're getting things from the DERs and the distribution system? Well, there's a few options. We often refer to these as the three P's of pricing, programs, and procurement. Pricing includes time varying rates and DER specific tariffs such as net metering. And so if how the DER is paid for, if or the rates can sort of influence or incentivize different outcomes from the DERs, such as maybe encouraging reductions in usage during peak periods. Programs include both demand response programs that shed peak demand and energy efficiency programs that lower usage across all hours. And finally, procurement involves competitive processes for non-wires alternatives that can help defer or avoid distribution system infrastructure investments. I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail in the following slides. But first, I just want to just introduce this figure on the right, which shows states in green that have some form of pricing program or procurement of distributed or distribution level DERs. Most states have one of the three Ps, but I think pricing and programs are more common than procurement. So pricing. This can involve the design of rates and DER-specific tariffs that incentivize grid services. Often that means incentivizing distribution capacity by reducing peak demand. So these rates are not just rates that are aligned with bulk power system needs. These are ones that are focused on those distribution system peaks. The peak period for a feeder may be different from the peak period for the entire system together. So in economic terms, the rate that is sort of incentivizing peak demand reductions in the distribution system would reflect the long run marginal cost, the cost of adding sort of new distribution capacity into the system. So these rates could be in the form of demand charges, which are in dollars per megawatt. It might be a dollar paid for your peak usage in a month in that period, or volumetric adders. So that's dollars per megawatt hour, which is just making sort of the cost of energy more expensive during a certain period. The figure to the right illustrates what a rate designed to provide distribution system capacity could look like. So this has a few different elements here. The dark blue is focused on the generation capacity. The bright blue is transmission capacity. And then this smaller one, which is a little bit harder to see, but is in sort of the middle of the day of August 29th in the figure, is the distribution capacity adder. One thing I'll point out is that this is still an illustrative example, but the distribution capacity adder is appearing sort of in the middle of the day as opposed to sort of the evening time when transmission and capacity prices are highest. So just reflecting what I've said earlier of how the peak periods of the distribution system may be different from those of the bulk power system as a whole. And also just an example here before we'll go into a more detailed example is that Con Edison has a rate they call it a smart home rate that includes demand charges during distribution events that the utility calls. So they're sort of charging customers on a dollar per kW basis during defined periods when demand is increasing in the distribution system. So here we have an example of another distribution level, a rate that's promoting distribution services offered by San Diego Gas and Electric, called their electric vehicle integration rate. So this rate is applied to level 2 chargers, which is sort of, it's like 5 or 6 kW. It's more than just putting your EV in for a very slow charge, but it's much smaller than a public charging station. So this rate applies to those level 2 chargers at workplaces and in multifamily buildings. It's a dynamic rate in which the prices are increasing during specific events of the utility calls. And it includes a distribution capacity adder, that dollar per megawatt hour that we introduced in the slide before, that is applying only to the 200 hours of the year in which the feeder has that highest load. So the adder is increasing when the utility calls an event in these hours. The figure to the right actually comes from an evaluation that looked at the impacts of this rate on a specific feeder in San Diego Gas and Electric's territory. So the vertical axis is the average load. The blue line is showing the load during the event, and then that checked line is an estimate of what load would have been absent the signal. And then the sort of diamonds, the red diamonds on the bottom are showing the estimate of savings. And the takeaway from this is pretty compelling. That seems to be there were pretty sizable reductions in demand during this event, which was as it was designed. And it's also occurring in the middle of the day when, which is, as mentioned earlier, so just the distribution system is going to have peaks at different times. So this one seemed to be having the events in the middle of the day, which makes sense if you're having workplace charging. It's more likely to occur in the middle of the day than in the evening. But these types of evaluations are really important for understanding the impact of these grid services and validating them. And I think just provides evidence to help people understand potential impact of these sorts of rate designs and how they can sort of achieve distribution system planning outcomes. These are still somewhat emerging, and I think the link that provide on a previous slide, or actually to a report that Lisa and JP wrote about some of these rates. So I encourage anyone who's interested to look into those. So next we'll talk about the programmatic aspect of providing distribution level grid services. Utilities can use geo-targeted DER programs to reduce load growth and the need for upgrades in the distribution system. They're geo-targeted in the sense that they're trying to address specific parts of the distribution system. It's not about just deploying more efficient devices or demand response thermostats in every home across the utility service territory. It's about doing that in a particular feeder where you know that there's a potential constraint emerging in the future. And these programs do typically address distribution capacity constraints. So their goal is reducing peak demand such that an upgrade is either deferred or avoided entirely. And as I mentioned, to be successful, there needs to be a clearly defined grid need that you're trying to achieve. So that could entail how much demand reduction is needed, the hours of the day and the time of year in which a constraint may occur, and how long that constraint may last. And you design these programs to achieve very specific outcomes on the distribution system in order to sort of avoid or defer some of those investments. The figure to the right provides an example of how a utility can plan to address one of these known grid needs with a geo-targeted program. So this comes from, I think, from Minnesota, and it shows estimated peak day load impacts from a number of different initiatives that are offered by Xcel Energy Minnesota. Again, these are estimates. So this was sort of before implementation, and it's not the measured impacts as we showed on the previous slide. The y-axis here is the demand savings, and the hours of the day are on the horizontal axis. And each of these different colors represents a different demand side initiative. So we have a commercial refrigeration, which is efficiency measures, is that light blue on the bottom. That's providing just a load reduction just about all hours because the refrigeration is operating in all hours. And then commercial lighting in green is sort of following the hours that people might be in offices or workplaces. So it's mostly sort of in the middle of the day. And then we have this demand response program coming in about 6 p.m. in the bright green. That's overlapping with this sort of gray bar that represents the peak period. So when all of these efforts sum together, they're meeting that or reaching that horizontal line you see at the top, which is that deferral goal, some target level of demand reduction. So I think this just illustrates that it's sometimes a combination of strategies that each have different types of impacts on the distribution system that, when considered together, can achieve one of these sort of stated goals of reducing demand on distribution feeders at particular times of the day and particular times of the year. So very related to this geo-targeted strategy is the procurement of grid services. So oftentimes these are targeting capacity service or capacity reductions as well. Um, and again, similar to the geo-targeted programs, the procurement of non-wires alternatives are trying to address a clearly defined grid need. That again is like need to reduce a certain amount of demand at a certain time of the year for a certain period in order to not go above some sort of critical amount of load on the distribution system. And these are always, in specific locations as well. So by reducing load on the distribution system, non-wires alternatives can reduce or defer or avoid the need for some upgrades. And the figure to the right sort of illustrates this impact. So the light blue area is representing the load that is exceeding some threshold. That indicates the need for the upgrade. Once you go above that, there's the determination it's safer to have some sort of physical upgrade. And then they estimate a load reduction requirement for the non-wires alternative that's represented by that trapezoid on the bottom. And I'll point out that that sort of stated load reduction requirement is larger than the sort of amount of load that it might be above the threshold. So there's some sort of safety margin baked in here. And they do that just to mitigate the risks of maybe the non-wires alternative not performing as expected. Non-wires alternatives can also provide some reliability services by shortening or avoiding outages. So that's the case for, say, a microgrid. Localized DERs and storage can provide energy while outages are being addressed. So there might be lines down to, or distribution lines down, but because of those DERs are sited near certain customers and there's a microgrid that connects it all, they're able to maintain some level of energy services while the primary electric service is being reconnected. And then this last slide is sort of about how utilities go about procuring these non-wires alternatives. So these procurements can avoid or address multi-million-dollar projects, but utilities don't use them in every case that there is a capacity strain in the distribution system. So to determine whether non-wires alternatives are suitable for a given grid need, a utility first needs to consider whether it's the right type of project, the timing of the project, and its cost. So this table to the right comes from Consolidated Edison's in New York's their distribution system plan, and it lays out their criteria for identifying what they consider projects that are suitable for non-wires alternatives. So they have this timeline criteria, and this is to make sure that basically they have enough time to develop and implement a non-wires alternative. So for these larger projects, they need a little bit more lead time. For smaller projects, like slightly shorter. It's difficult to turn these around, a month out. So they need to make sure that if they're anticipating some sort of need on the distribution system, there's ample time to sort of assess whether an NWA can, likely reduce it and then go out through the whole procurement process and then have the winner of that procurement process then install and operate the DERs. There's also cost criteria, and that's to make sure that it's actually worthwhile to go through the process of procuring an NWA. So if it's a very small project, the cost of procurement could exceed the project. So you want to focus it on likely larger projects. And then for projects that do pass suitability criteria, the utility can then issue a request for proposal that characterizes the grid need, makes very clear to potential implementers what needs to be achieved, and then specifies criteria for evaluating the bids and selecting things, providing some transparency in the process. So anyone who's involved understands, how they can frame their offerings to address the grid need. And then once a bid is accepted and the vendor deploys DERs, utilities can then have those evaluations similar to what we saw with that EV grid rate or EV rate in San Diego Gas and Electric's territory, sort of assess what happened and understand, were those reductions that we needed to occur, did they occur? And with that, I think I can move into Q&A.
Great, thanks, John. We have a couple of questions already in the chat box. It's not too late to add them or raise your hand or just unmute yourself. So one question was about tools. So I put a link to webinars that are coming up on forecasting this month and next month, so super timely. So any of you can sign up for those. They're intended for public utility commissions and state energy offices, but I think it's fine for municipal cooperative utilities and tribal governments to sign up as well. It's totally fine. So the one question was about, small targeted regions. And if you or JP have any recommendations for any specific tool that can be used to forecast electricity demand. So I know it's a little bit off topic because you're, focused on DERs, but obviously they're highly related.
Yeah, that is a good question. I'll say if you are working, well, starting with knowing what load is right now can be very helpful. I think, well, if I'm reading right, if you're working in California, I think there is reporting at the zip code level from investor-owned utilities of what usage is. So that can be a helpful starting point of just knowing what the general energy load is. Using those tools I mentioned, ResStock and Comstock can be quite helpful because you can just, get a load shape for what like 100% of buildings with heat pumps or heat pump water heaters looks like, and then sort of just apportion that as need be and say, oh, what if 25% of the state had them? And so those you can use pretty directly, and you can use them at an hourly basis, or even at like an annualized basis if you just want to get general increases in energy demand. And they allow you to sort of get those results at least the county level, I think, in the US. There's increased uncertainty the more zoomed in you get with that tool, but it can give you a sense of sort of the direction of electricity increases by what, but you'd have to specify some of the sort of adoption levels.
All right, now we have another question. How are entities integrating load forecasts that might span long timeframes with forecasting distribution system integrity, which may require analysis on a much smaller time scale, more immediate needs?
That is a good question. JP might have some perspective on this.
Why
I
don't,
think,
why don't we see if JP
Yeah.
would like to adjust that? Because JP has done some work, for example, with Indiana on this topic. JP, are you? Great.
I'm here. I don't know if I heard the entire question, but let me see. I think it was in the chat, right?
Yeah, it's in the chat. I'll be happy to repeat it. How are entities integrating load forecasts that might span long time frames with forecasting distribution system needs, which may require analysis on much smaller timescales or much more immediate? So like your work for Indiana might be an example where, they were looking to integrate both a distribution level kind of issue with their longer term energy planning.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say, and there was a recent presentation by Julieta Giraldes on this very topic, sort of outlining how the trends in distribution system planning have been to start expanding what used to be the near-term 2-3 year out forecast into a 5 to 10 year forecast, in part because of these reasons, but to make the integration more seamless. Utilities still remain with a 2-3 year forecast that they use for largely operational purposes because they have different tools that they can use to solve load forecasting issues in the near term compared to the long term. But long-term forecast will inform substation build-outs, new transformer purchases at the substation level. So we're talking about the 50 megawatt transformers that have 3-4 year lead times versus the 2-3 year forecast might inform switching operations and minor repowering that can still keep reliability, but with much more localized and specific interventions. So these two are now being used, and the long-term forecast is starting to now be really responsive to the fact that several key assets for distribution systems, and especially in the interface with transmission system, are becoming have long enough lead times that you need to plan way ahead. And naturally, that's leading to a better integration, as we'll see later in my presentation, of distribution system and transmission system forecasts.
That's great. Well, perfect lead in to your presentation. Thanks, John.
Do we want to give folks a little break, or shall we continue right
No, let's
away?
push on.
All right. And well, thanks everyone again for being here. This is my second time presenting this week. You folks might remember me from the reliability presentation on Monday. But now I'm going to switch to explaining and hopefully perfect complementarity to what Sean just described in terms of the use of distributed energy resources in distribution systems. I'm going to look at the complementary vision on how this is looking from the bulk power systems. Next slide. So just so we're all clear, and I think Sean had a very similar slide when he opened, we're looking at the whole value chain. And as you know, these DERs are being installed at the consumption level, so to the far right of this diagram, and typically behind the meter, there are an increasing number of DERs that are being installed before the meter, owned by utility companies or third parties that are providing some of the grid services that Sean was outlining. But those assets, as installed downstream, do have impacts in generation and transmission. And so there are two main processes or sets of processes that we're going to study and understand how they are integrating this adoption and operation of DERs to understand the impacts upstream. So one is in vertical integrated jurisdictions is long-term resource planning that is coupled with transmission planning, typically occurring even in the same process, not necessarily. And in restructured jurisdictions, which are the ones that run wholesale markets like PJM or MISO, there is also transmission planning processes, and there is a whole set of wholesale market design elements that are being affected by DERs. And so we're going to explore these separately. So in the next slide, I'm going to show roughly what we're going to cover, following a little bit this sort of value chain structure that I just showed. We're going to focus on the bulk power system, and in doing that, we're going to split in resource planning and wholesale markets. I'm going to give a one slide, really 3 slides introduction of what integrated resource planning is. So just make sure that we're all in the same page on what that is. And then I'm going to go into explaining how DERs are forecasted and internalized in integrated resource planning. And then I'm going to delve into one specific DER, which is price-based demand response, to really show you step by step how it's being modeled and incorporated into IRP. And in doing that, highlighting the challenges that IRPs have from this high-level systems, bulk power system perspective, to really represent well what's happening at the finer level of price-based or customer-based demand response. I'm going to take a really quick tour on integrated systems planning to show alternative ways in which DERs could be incorporated into the planning process. These are not mainstream at all. We have been proposing this for many years, and very slowly some utilities and regulators have been taken up on different aspects of integrated systems planning, and we're going to cover a couple different approaches that exist to bring in the impacts of DER and to plan systems concurrently with DERs and utility scale resources at the same level. And finally, we're going to spend a few slides covering the way DERs are impacting wholesale markets, how they have been historically adopted in wholesale markets, and briefly cover some basic aspects of FERC Order 2222, which opened or is hoping to open a large access for DERs and DER aggregators to wholesale markets across the country. Next slide. So IRP, let's very quickly, since we're going to spend about 2/3 of these slides talking about DERs in IRP, let me briefly explain what it is. So IRP is a process, it's a plan, and it's a document. The process of IRP that lasts several years typically involves going here in this diagram, finding the least cost portfolio of resources that is able to satisfy expected load and is also compliant with reliability, regulatory requirements. It meets basic operational constraints, and it includes several market factors and external factors to the planning process. Typically, the way IRP is developed, and this diagram to the right is kind of a blueprint that describes relatively well the general gist of IRPs, even though things change across jurisdictions, is that you have several model inputs, one of which, one of the key ones is load forecast, but as you can see going down that list, you also see demand side resources. And all these inputs are processed through scenarios, are modeled or framed through regulatory requirements, and they're input into 3 types of different models, 2 of them economic, one of them a technical model. The production cost model tells you what is the optimal way to operate a system. The capacity expansion model tells you what are the investment decisions that you need to make over time to meet load. And the resource adequacy assessment tells you in a stochastic or sort of statistical way whether your resulting portfolio is meeting your reliability targets with an analysis that is much richer than what you can do in a capacity expansion or production cost models. And so these 3 models are specialized in certain aspects of the power system, and they have to talk to each other to produce portfolios, to produce action plans, and integrate potentially with other proceedings. Next slide. So IRPs are used across about 2/3 of the United States. You can see here in blue the range of states that have IRP filing requirements. The frequency of those requirements and the filings vary across this jurisdiction. It's typically anywhere between a year or 2 to 5 years. And in some jurisdictions, there are interim updates that have to be filed as well, following certain guidelines. There are some states that have a long-term plan filing requirement that's not necessarily an IRP, but is akin to one. And there's a few states that don't have any type of requirement for long-term plans, and where the decisions, the planning decisions are generally happening within the utility, and they become public only when an entity files for a certificate of public need or public necessity or need, which is essentially a request for an approval from the regulator to construct a specific type of plan or deploy a specific type of asset. The regulatory scrutiny of these plans vary. In a few cases, very few cases, there's an approval of the plan. This is really the case for 2 states in the US where the plan is approved, and then you have a much closer connection between the plan and the procurement. In many cases, there is an acknowledgement from the Public Utility Commission that the plan is achieving or meeting the guidelines, but the plan remains indicative. And the actual procurement decisions that the utility ends up making may or may not coincide with what the plan says. And in some other cases, the docket is litigated, and it's a much harder, much more closer scrutiny over the outcome of the plan. Next slide. And one important thing here in terms of the planning process is that it's a heavily model-oriented exercise. Even though there is substantial stakeholder involvement and many aspects of the plan remain qualitative, like, for example, understanding the regulatory environment or understanding how other economic activity might affect load and the plan outcomes itself. IRP remains a heavily model-oriented exercise that, as I mentioned, has these 3 core models: production cost, capacity expansion, and resource adequacy models to verify and select portfolios, but also has sub-models that are related to, for example, weather models that are feeding into the resource adequacy assessment, load forecasting models, and within those, there are potential studies and models that actually try to predict adoption of distributed resources in the service territory. And so in analyzing in the next few slides the way the Rs are incorporated here, we're going to largely focus on the way they're forecasted, and you will see intentionally some level of overlap with what Sean just presented. And then we'll go in detail on what are the challenges of bringing, from that top blue box, the DREE potential study, to bring those results into the models on an equal footing. Next slide. So let's go into the forecasting DRs. And I know that we just, less than an hour ago, Sean presented also a set of slides that were describing how at the distribution system level, DERs are forecasted. what I'm showing here are best practices, leading practices in recently filed IRPs. If I had shown this same set of slides 10 years ago, what I would have gotten are very high level top-down forecasts for DER adoption. The levels were rather small. The utilities didn't know too much about them, with maybe counted exceptions of states that had seen DER penetration for now 2 or 3 decades. But many states had not had enough experience, and they were fine doing a top-down sort of quick estimate of levels of adoption for DER. That has changed over the last decade. And now the sort of leading practice and what you see most commonly across most states and entities is an effort similar to distribution systems to come from the bottom up and to model adoption and operation individually and try to get it more accurately. So one of the first leading practices for DER adoption is to have higher granularity, developing hourly load forecasts that reflect diurnal or nocturnal profiles, seasonal patterns, and potentially daily and weekly energy needs, which is important for storage. And then getting these forecasts to match the unit of analysis and the capacity expansion model and production cost models that have been hourly for some time now. One example in this load forecast that includes end-use based approaches is, for example, this from Seattle City Light in Washington State, which in his 2022 IRP developed what you see here in the right, developed adoption and usage patterns for several different types of end uses. And they use load shapes to represent the hourly shape of these end uses. And there's here one typical day example. And in doing this, they develop a number of potential statistically informed load shapes based on weather year. So they made their end-use model usage sensitive to weather, such that they can build these load forecasts into the resource adequacy assessment, which relies on weather-sensitive data to simulate many possible combinations and iterations of load and DERs. Next slide. As I was mentioning, the leading practice in forecasting is using end-use models, and in doing that, doing away with a sort of historical trend to use econometric or time series approaches, which are potentially useful for some aspects, but in general tend to miss some of the details in terms of separating adoption trends and trying to recognize specific operational patterns in distributed resources. I think Sean covered this, so I'm just going to briefly mention how separately forecasting the adoption or saturation of DERs and their normal operation is quite important. And we see that typically in many IRPs being at least transparently communicating their assumptions behind the types of operations. There's probably significant work that can be done into what kinds of operations, and in that there is this emerging aspect of flexible operation where the operation assumptions behind the DER that typically were very inertial. For example, if you have a PV system, it's just producing, depending on the weather patterns. When you couple that with the storage unit, the whole system becomes dispatchable, and the operation can become flexible depending on, market signals or other types of incentives. And so it's important that the utility at least offers thoughts on how this flexible operation is being reflected into forecasts. And here to the right, you see examples of EV and PV and electric vehicle forecasting from Portland General Electric's 2023 IRP using these methods. Next slide. From a technology adoption perspective, this is delving a little bit into the differences between BAS or S-curves models and propensity of adoption models. Sean also covered this. Historically, IRPs could do enough with an S-curve model that just describes a level of penetration on the market or based on current or unexpected shape for the dynamics of penetration based on current levels. So it was a relatively simple model that was enough to say at the systems level what to expect in terms of penetration for certain types of DERs. We have now moved into, as in distributed distribution systems, in trying to model propensity of adoption based on specific customer decisions. In this case, this example here from Pacific Core's 2025 IRP is showing how they use the payback time to simulate the willingness to adopt distributed generation. And this was important in the IRP because they had pockets in their service territory where they could foresee a relatively large distributed generation that would displace utility scale resources. And they wanted to get ahead to understand what were the economic conditions or drivers through which customers would adopt the resources and how that would inform Pacific Core's outcomes. And I think they implemented a couple of scenarios with these to understand, and you can see here in the low, high, and medium curves, what were the range of possible impacts from an energy and a capacity perspective that later would ripple back up to their decisions at the utility scale level. Next slide. Finally, on another example of technology adoption is on EVs. This shows, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but NIPSCO is a pretty good example of a bottom-up forecast for electric vehicles that is well systematically built. I don't necessarily agree with some of the assumptions they make, but the structure of the forecast is pretty leading and good practice. They separately model an EV growth rate with some methods. They have an energy usage per vehicle that determines consumption with separate methods. And then they have a charging behavior analysis that determines the peak load impacts with a separate method. And so these three pieces are analyzed for 4 classes of vehicles. So they separately establish these for light-duty vehicles, medium, heavy-duty, and then with transit or other types of fleets like that, inheriting some of the analysis that MISO had developed in the transmission expansion plan future scenarios. And so this is a good example of how the level of detail that IRPs are trying to achieve to model distributed energy resources, in this case EVs, with a heavily focused bottom-up approach. One thing that is important to notice here is that all of the IRPs and entities that filing these IRPs that I have used for examples are vertically integrated. So they do have a certain incentive to develop these complex, more elaborate, granular forecasts because they can use them for distribution systems and then inherit the same models and aggregate them to use for bulk power system planning. So there's a certain logic in that finally, after perhaps a century, the distribution system and bulk power system areas of these entities are starting to talk a little bit more, owing to the needs to plan for distributed energy resources in a tighter, more integrated way. Next slide. Let's now delve a little bit or in substantial detail on price-based demand response, which is one specific type of DER, and perhaps one that requires the least amount of assets, of infrastructure, because it's really focused on making or shaping load based on passing specific time varying rates. Demand response has been assessed and modeled in IRP for decades through what's called market potential studies, or MPS. The market potential studies, as the name says, was focused on determining how much energy efficiency and demand response was technically and economically available for the utility to procure. And in doing that, they had to make a substantial number of assumptions to take what could be a massive amount of potential, because some of these entities have millions of customers, each one of which could be deploying a demand response resource, and shrinking this into something that could be procured by the utility within reasonable timeframes, at reasonable costs, and with reasonable technical performance. And doing all this with not a whole lot of empirical data to support it. As I mentioned, price-based demand response is one specific type of demand response that's based on times and time-based rates. And I'm going to cover some of that in a second. And so what we wanted to understand in this research that Lisa and I led a couple of years ago was how is it that utility characterized and model different time-based rates, what assumptions that we're using to define price-based demand response, and what were eventually best practices in representing these in IRP. And here to the right, you see the cover of our brief that you can go read if you want more details on what we end up doing. But this presentation will cover most of what we did with good level of detail. Next slide. So the first approach was to understand first, lay out a workflow that describes in general how demand response, but most specifically price-based demand response, is built and brought into IRP. And so starting from the left here, typically the utility will start by identifying certain types of demand response resources and might discard some that are not considered plausible or technologically feasible. In the case of price-based demand response, there will be rates that typically the utility has already filed in their tariff. And in some cases, there might be a couple of emerging rates that they might be testing, and they can be included in the analysis. Two key variables that explain the potential for rates to be included for load shaping is the amount of customers that might adopt it, the expected participation rate, and the amount of load reduction that I can achieve of those customers. And we'll see how those were modeled. As I mentioned, these two values plus other assumptions go into determining a technical potential. And then there is some gray zone analysis, and this is something it wasn't exactly clear how the utilities would go from this technical potential that tended to be large to what they call an achievable potential. That's something we wanted to try to understand a little bit better, and it's hard to find clear explanations in the documents on why they would find thousands of megawatts of technical potential and suddenly shrink this to a lower amount. Of course, one thing to bear in mind here at all times is that regulated utilities don't have a high incentive to avoid load, to reduce load, because they earn a profit through investing in assets and rate basing them. So whenever they're performing these analyses and reducing the amount of load they have to meet, they're essentially losing money on the rate base. And it's not their fault, it's the way the incentives are built. And so regulators have struggled from ways to make utilities do a proper, unbiased analysis on this side. And this is part of what we're trying to inform through this study. But this tells you sort of a general tension that exists in DER adoption in general, is that insofar those DERs are not owned by the utility and not rate base, they are displacing potential profits, future profits. And so there's always a tension in adopting those versus using traditional capital-based methods to meet load. As this achievable potential is compared to program costs, so how much it actually costs to run these programs, then that produces a certain portfolio of demand response, energy efficiency, and other type of DERs that are procured by the utility and then go back into the planning process. And we'll see a couple of ways in which that happens. In the original paper that Lisa and I wrote, we focused both on integrated resource planning and DSP, distribution system planning. I'm going to just refer to the first one in these next few slides. Next slide. So just to get us on the same page of what time varying rates are, there are typically 5 groups. These are sort of groups of rates. They change quite a bit in how they're implemented, but roughly, many of you might be familiar with the time of use rates, TOUs, where you have simply 2 blocks, sometimes 3 blocks per day, occasionally changing the size of those blocks and the times and the levels of prices per season. And those are offered to customers. In 1 or 2 jurisdictions, those are actually now mandatory, and volumetric rates have been displaced. But for the most part, across the country, they remain a choice. And the adoption levels are not incredibly high yet. From that point down, you have much more elaborate rates. Real-time pricing is the opposite, where the customers are seeing wholesale prices or something proxy to a wholesale price, so an hourly varying cost of electricity that they're being exposed to and expected to make consumption decisions upon. And then variable peak pricing, critical peak pricing, and critical peak rates are all ways to send real-time signals that have some level of timing for customers to respond. Either typically these pricing methods are focused on specific events, so the customer is warned with some time that they're going to be an event and that the price might go up, or that if they reduce load during a certain period, they might receive a rebate. And so customers are on an event by event basis can decide how to participate and whether to respond to the pricing signal. Next slide. In terms of times of DRs, most utilities characterize programs as dispatchable and non-dispatchable, and price-based DR is typically considered non-dispatchable because it's expected that customers are making their own decisions based on price signals that they're seeing. In very few cases, there might be algorithms making these choices, but it's not as common yet. It's just that's where things are expected to go in the near future. About a third of the utilities in our sample, so we based all this work in examining 12 IRP documents filed at around the time we were conducting this work in 2022, 2023. So about a third of the utilities in the sample just deemed that price-based demand response was not suitable because the predictability was too poor. So you couldn't rely on this resource to show up in the ways you expect it to show up as a capacity resource, or the volume was too low. There wasn't just enough out there to even warrant studying it. For the 2/3 of utilities that did have it, then we conduct the analysis that you will see in the next few slides. Almost all the IRPs that we study include some sort of direct load control or interruptible load program. We didn't include this directly because it wasn't clear from this that whether these programs that were direct controlled were also supported by a price signal, or if there were generally just an automated signal coming from the utility that could be obeying other technical parameters and not necessarily a price specific or rate parameter. But this is so you know there are other ways that are relatively popular to manage and shape load. But we again, this work is focused specifically on price-based demand response or rates. Next slide. So the most common rates that we found in this sample of IRPs were the time of use rates, and to a lesser extent the critical peak pricing. The CPP it was mostly oriented towards commercial and industrial, but we found several entities that were already offering it to residential customers, although with very little uptake. But the time of use rates were available to all customer segments in general, and most utilities were offering them actively. Many utilities were offering more than one type of rate as well. There were 2 utilities that screened out the critical peak pricing and real-time pricing programs, in part because they didn't have the metering infrastructure that's needed. In this case, advanced metering infrastructure, or colloquially named as smart meters. It's important to understand that many of these rates do require some advanced level of metering to be implemented. At the same time, it's important to consider that the cost of implementing those meters could be part of the overall program assessment. If the rate operation is such that the benefits for the system, including the cost of the meters, is still higher than the benefits are higher than the cost of the meters, plus implementation and administration costs, then it would make sense to deploy these. And unfortunately, the utilities didn't even get there. There is, as I was mentioning earlier, all these different rates can be programmed and calibrated in very different ways, none of which, unfortunately, is reported in the market potential studies that we analyze. So we're left to either manually go to the utility tariff offer and understanding what exactly they have. It would be much better if there was a way to communicate these in a more standardized way to understand what exact price levels the time of use rate was assuming, or what kinds of types of events the critical peak pricing was assuming. There were, in some cases, utilities did communicate the number of events for critical peak pricing. That was true, but we did not have any information about how the time of use was shaped. Next slide. As I mentioned, one of the key variables to understand the potential is how many customers might adopt a rate. And about 2/3 of the utilities in our set clearly reported participation rates by type and customer segment. But only one distinguished what's called an opt-in and opt-out. And as you can see here in this utility ID 1, it really matters. So if, in case you don't know, opt-in, opt-out relates to whether you are mandating the customer into a specific rate and the customer has to call someone and say, hey, I don't want to be in this rate, versus you keep the customer in the volumetric standard rate and you give them the option to sign in. That's the opt-in approach. And of course, the opt-out, as we have known for now many years, opt-out typically leads to much, much higher enrollment rates because customers just most of them don't even care on enrolling out, or they feel that if they're enrolled in, they can benefit, which is actually true. In some cases, another utility did have a low and a high value. It wasn't clear if they were referring to an opt-in and opt-out. It might be given the numbers. But it may have been also a good scenario-based approach where they were thinking, well, they might make a low effort and a high effort, and in adoption, and so it's a good example of how scenario-based can also be brought into simulating DR adoption, like Sean also showed. The sources of these numbers that you see here that are actually quite consequential were rarely reported. We don't really know where the 13% came from, or that 7%, or that 23% down there. What is interesting is that we're relatively consistent. Like if you look across, across the columns, the values are not dramatically different. If you dispense with the opt-in, opt-out difference, for example, in the time of use for commercial industrial, this is the fourth row, you have a 10, 13% value, 14% value that is around adoption levels for commercial. And there seems to be remarkable coincidence across utilities. We don't really know exactly why this is. It might be that there are really few consultants that develop these reports, and the same consultant might be just porting the same value that they got from somewhere. But there is definitely a need where these values could be more transparent and better informed by empirical analysis. Next slide. The second big important value here that conditions the actual volume of demand response that they could procure is how much load I expect a participant might reduce. This is also a value that should be informed by empiricals. We believe that is the case, but again, we had really little information from the sources of these values. And what we did find is that here we did have less convergence. We have assumptions about summer and winter reductions that were understandable because many of these demand response programs are encouraging, for example, the use of AC or other types of weather sensitive end uses. And so they expect customers to have different, for example, a customer that uses air conditioning but has a natural gas-based heating has a much lower capacity to reduce load in the winter compared to the summer. So some of these numbers are reflecting that. But the values themselves and why they're different, it's very hard to explain. And again, this gives you a flavor of how hard it is to find the right values to model these and to produce credible estimates of, in this case, the load reduction per participant. I will highlight this third utility in this list that did make an effort to distinguish the cases where they have the regular control supporting the rate. So the customer was offered, in addition to the rates, a direct, for example, thermostat management system, smart thermostat that would reduce and adjust temperature set points for them in response to a rate. And they are correctly assuming here a 3x increase for the residential customers when having access to that device, which is very interesting variation over the general gist where we don't even know whether there's an assumption about assisting devices or smart devices supporting these rates in the other reduction estimates. Next slide. So with the combination of these yields, what's called a technical and the achievable potential. So the technical potential is literally the rate participation times the number of customers that I can target times the load reduction. That produces a certain percent reduction in peak load that can then be transferred to my capacity expansion model that now, rather than meeting, say, 1,000 megawatts of load, going to meet maybe 190 megawatts of load because of these values. Then there is this hard to explain derating to move from the technical potential to what they call the achievable potential. And the qualitative explanations of what explains that transition were hard to find. Typically, it's related to this. It's going to be hard to capture these customers. Some of these are too far out. They might not want to be enrolled, or they may enroll and then they might quit. So they're trying to essentially, it's a dose of reality, but it's hard to understand exactly what informs these derates. And then ultimately, what's interesting is as we calculate these potential ranges, we have a really relatively wide range of percent reductions that are expected on an annual basis. For example, in the time of use, we have all the range from 0.25% all the way up to 4%, which is, it's almost like 16 times more. So how is it that utilities are arriving to such different results, and why explains those variations? Again, it's unfortunately hard to explain with the data that we had access to. Next slide. In this one, I'm just going to briefly mention that one important element here is the assumptions behind costs, because all these programs that the utilities have to implement to both capture and enroll these customers and operate the programs to achieve demand response are not free. They have some costs, and they offer here in this table, we collected all these costs. And perhaps the important thing, or maybe two key takeaways here, is that half of the IRPs did not report any costs. So we didn't even know if they were considering them to be free, or they were just not reporting them. And so the second is that the costs are remarkably similar, even though, again, not particularly supported. So we don't really know where these costs come from. What another interesting element here is, as we mentioned earlier, the cost of advanced metering are not included here. So we're not sure what would happen if you were to include advanced metering and maybe demand response would pay for that. It was just not analyzed as a resource, and it would be a non-wire solution, but unfortunately it was not considered in this analysis. Next slide. With all these values, the cost of implementation and reduction potential, we can calculate average levelized costs of capacity. So this is how much dollars per kilowatt year it's costing me to achieve or run a demand response program. And these costs we compare these costs to the cost of new entry, which is a value that reflects the cost of new capacity to meet peak demand at the bulk power system level, which is, we think, a valid comparison here. And what's interesting is that all these costs that you're seeing here are substantially low. And so there's a few things that come up. Well, if they're much lower than the cost of new entry, you can imagine the cost of new entry is about $100 to $120 per kilowatt year in general across the board. That, of course, varies substantially, but it gives you a flavor that these values here are between half and a tenth of that, or even lower. So the question that comes immediately is, well, if they're so low, why don't we procure more of that? And again, this comes in direct tension, in direct response to this tension that there's not a whole lot of incentive to procure more of these resources. The other important piece here is that all the potential decisions are being made outside of the IRP. All this effort is to determine what is called this efficient potential, but it's not really compared to the actual cost of resources. So these DERs here are just being compared to some assessment of what's plausible and reasonable from the utilities perspective, but it's not being compared to the cost of the resources that they're quote unquote displacing. If you were to compare these, again, that cost of new entry, that roughly reflects the cost of a new resource, you might infer that we might as well adopt significantly more demand response or other types of DERs. And that comparisons are actually not even available unless you develop a model where you are incorporating these values on their own into the capacity expansion model and selecting from the capacity expansion model demand response as a resource to fulfill your load needs. Unfortunately, that model, even though it exists, is not the most popular model, and there's maybe 2 or 3 entities that are developing that competitive resource or competitive resource implementation in their IRP. And this, again, this is a hint of what will become the object of our analysis in a little bit on integrated systems plan. Next slide. This is exactly what I was talking about, and I didn't remember I had put this slide or not, but the values that we were just looking, at least a few entities, this is what comes from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, they create a supply curve. You can see here from the bottom left, commercial critical peak pricing is costing -5 kilowatts per year. I'm not going to go into details of how you get a negative value, but that's what they were, what they had assessed. And this goes all the way up on different programs. You see the list goes up in different types of programs, all of which have a certain cost per kilowatt year. And if you look at this and you shift it in your head, this is a supply curve, where as you move to the right, you add more capacity, and the marginal cost of that capacity costs more. So you can think that a model would be traversing this curve as comparing these levels of procurement with other resources that are utility scale, asset-based resources, and eventually landing on a point that is optimal, where and that point might be well above the program targets that regulators had set up, because the program targets were set up with certain conditions, market conditions that may have shifted. So in our analysis, about 3/4 of the IRPs that we analyzed did not construct these supply curves, in part because price-based demand response is not treated as a resource. It's treated as a load reduction that then I put into my models. And so I internalize these demand response impacts just as a reduced load to meet, but not as a resource to procure. And so in some ways, I'm preempting the acquisition of DERs based on my expectations as an analyst, more than letting the model make a choice. And that's one of the key sort of tensions that we're trying to solve through this work. Next slide. In terms of shortcomings of private, what we saw is that in general, hard to track the way private demand response is considered. Little support for most of the values, lack of transparency. So in general, I would say the process is well laid out, but the support for each one of the values and assumptions in that process is not super clear. And then towards the end, the lack of use as a supply curve approach leads to potentially under procuring demand response that could be economically optimal. Next slide. And so in terms of leading practices, is pretty much the opposite of what we just described. So treating demand response as a resource, not necessarily as load reduction. And this, again, you can think in your minds, as I say, demand response or price-based demand response, which was the object of this work. You can think about pretty much any DER, PV, EV load management, energy efficiency, different flavors of energy efficiency, distributed generation, diesel, natural gas, battery storage management. All of those could be incorporated into IRP following these same guidelines. Granular cost data, it would be important to construct a proper supply curve. And then using scenario stochastic analysis is important because one thing that price demand response is tricky is to understand whether the customer is going to show up or not in that specific, very critical, stressful hour. They might not show up because they're not home. They might not decide to lower a value because they are comfortable where they are and they're willing to pay the money to keep operating. So those are important things that should be modeled stochastically and incorporated into the analysis. Next slide. All right, now we're going to go into, hold on, this is the one that can you go back, Sean, a little bit? One more? Okay, all right. Okay, good. So go into the next one, please, but give me 1 second there. Yeah, so now we're going to jump into integrated systems planning. So I think the key takeaway that I want to communicate from this example from price-based demand response is the fact that it's not treated as a resource. So I am not making trade-off decisions between distributed resources and utility scale resources. I am making a separate analysis that constrains the certain amount of distributed resources. I'm constraining the load because it's being shaped by distributed resources. And then I'm putting all that into a supply side model that is making decisions of utility scale, for the most part, utility scale resources that are being deployed to meet that modified load. The supply curve approach that I mentioned towards the end is one way to deal with that. But now we're going to go into one further step and showing more integrated approaches to make DER deployment choices more actively and endogenously connected to utility scale choices. Next slide. So I think these 3 bullets outline what I just said. I want to focus on one in the middle here that says that one other aspect of one problem with the supply side treatment of DERs as a resource is that it doesn't quite capture whether and how these DERs are imposing constraints or imposing issues, creating issues at the distribution system level. Because in general, bulk power system remains a transmission and generation exercise. And so if I suddenly say that I can procure thousands of megawatts of distributed resources, there's really no indication that it's actually physically feasible to install those resources and bring them up to the bulk power system to meet load, or meet load downstream, which is what they might do as well. It's unclear exactly whether those distributed resources are going to flow from one zone to the other, or whether they're going to meet load locally. In other case, they might impose a number of operational issues at the local level that are not captured in these models. And so we're going to cover a couple of planning approaches that can account for these issues and is one step further on integrating in equal level decisions at the distribution and bulk power system level. Next slide. So going back to our diagram of the value chain and the power system, one important thing to remember is that there is this bright, dark, solid red line dividing the bulk power system and the distribution system historically. These have been different sections, different departments in utilities that are vertically integrated. They have barely talked to each other. They don't share even the load forecasts are different. They have a different load forecast of distribution. You would imagine that it's the same, of course. Nope. It's a full forecast that distribution produces. Sometimes they pass it to their colleagues in bulk power system who take the forecast and make different changes and adjust it. In some cases, they do, of course, add types of customers that distribution system folks are not planning for. But there has been a stark separation over time in these two, and there is now an emerging need to bring them together. Next slide. So to understand the impact of DERs across the domains, again, the challenge is that the planning processes are not even set up for that. They're set up to be in separated processes. And the models have evolved to be separated models. So we have a modeling and a process challenge here. And I'm going to offer two very emerging approaches that can address these limitations: sequential integrated modeling and comprehensive integrated modeling. These are all part of what's called now integrated systems planning. Integrated systems planning tries to capture power system level decisions. In some cases, the same name is used to determine gas electric trade-offs. So it's still a concept that is taking shape and being implemented in a few jurisdictions. But I'm going to show examples of what these two models do. Next slide.
Hey, JP, I just want to do a time
Yep.
check. We have 14 minutes left. We have a hard stop at the top of the hour because there's another
Okay.
Presenter. And we do have one question.
Okay, I'll try to speed up. So in the sequential model, we have a common set of scenarios and forecasts that are run through parallel distribution and bulk power system efforts, such that we can have technical and economic impacts and then rate impacts that are consistent because they use the same basic assumptions. And in the next slide, I can show, not going to go into detail, but this shows the implementation of this for an example that Lisa was alluding earlier, that we did for Indiana in their 21st Century Energy Policy Task Force, where we define load forecasts and adoption levels for PV, EV, and storage, and then we ran separate planning processes using different software at the bulk power system level and the distribution system level, and then integrated all the results toward the end, knowing that the impacts on both were being consistent because they were using the same input and basic assumptions. In the next slide, you can see that some of the results were showing that we had these 5 different scenarios with different levels of adoption of PV and storage and other DERs. And it is showing that there are certain level. In this case, it was showing that there were interesting savings in costs for generation and transmission when we had large penetration of DERs, in part because the distribution systems that we were analyzing had enough hosting capacity to absorb these without having to incur in costs. And we were able to verify that through this analysis. In contrast, in the boundary scenario here to the right that had a much higher penetration of resources, there is a small but measurable distribution cost impact that it's coming with the generation and transmission costs that are necessary to meet those new load levels, and it's at least able to account for those instead of ignoring them. Next slide. In contrast, the comprehensive integrated framework uses some type of model that is rarely available, and the one that's used here is one that we developed at LBNL for this purpose, which is a capacity expansion model exercise that simulates the bulk power system in addition to the distribution system and deployment and operation decisions behind the meter or in front of the meter, but at the distribution system level. So it's a really large single model that uses many simplifications to be able to essentially simulate the entire value chain. We're still verifying some aspects of this model, but it can provide really interesting contrasts and results. And the next slide, you will see, this is the implementation that we had. The grid access and planning model is used to provide this single capacity expansion and production cost model that's jointly optimizing, as if we had a single planner that is deciding whether to invest in rooftop solar at the distribution system level or utility scale solar at the bulk power system level, and with that, any other type of resource, either the ones that have parallels or analogs in the distribution system, or just resources that don't. What's interesting here is to see that resources that do have analogs like PV and storage and diesel that could be installed in either distributed system settings or bulk power system settings. And this model in particular can be operated as a decentralized decision-making model, or it can emulate what happens these days where customers make certain decisions and then the bulk power system follows on those load realizations. And the next slide, you can show very briefly, without going into a lot of detail, some of these nice trade-offs. I just want you to see that these charts have positives and negative values, which suggests that as I move into some of these different scenarios, the model is able to tell me to decide that is cost optimal to adopt higher levels of distributed resources as a trade-off of utility scale resources that are not being adopted. And this is the kind of decision-making process that is highly integrated that we're going for, that solves this tension of being able to decide on distributed resources at the bulk power system level at the same time. Next slide. One quick example that's approximating this is Duke Energy's integrated system and operations planning. This is a sort of a sequential model. I just wanted to mention that this exists. This actually was developed after the original Indiana work that we developed in 2019. This effort started in 2022, 23. So there is at least one example where an effort to make this set of inputs consistent and then running all the utility planning processes on top exists out there. Next slide. And we're going to finalize with a couple slides that talk about the wholesale market. Most of what I described was integrated resource planning, and the parentheses through the systems integration is kind of also based in integrated resource planning. It's a heavily model-oriented exercise. But the wholesale markets are different compared to IRP. In wholesale markets, investment decisions are made by decentralized actors that are not regulated. They're following market signals. And while the operations are technically similar, in wholesale markets, the decisions of what to procure and how much to procure is all based on markets that are set up and designed by ISOs and RTOs. Next slide. I'm relying for these few slides in not only the report, but also the slides themselves from my colleague Signe Forrester, who lead authored the report that you see here. And this report was focused specifically on understanding what is the current level of participation of DERs in wholesale markets and what exactly they're doing. And so what we see is that there is a trend to start opening up and relaxing restrictions for third-party aggregators to participate in wholesale markets. They also identify that the majority of customers that participate in wholesale markets tend to be large commercial or industrial loads, and they're not yet quite small DERs, although, again, this is going to change recently with the recent passing of FERC Order 2222 that I'm going to cover in a little bit. They identified that the demand response participation model, this is the way the demand response is allowed to bid into the market and make money, didn't fully leverage the capacity of the DERs. And I think the report goes into more detail into that. Next slide. So there's a few examples of DERs that are used in wholesale markets that are allowed to participate. One example is, for example, 290 megawatts of backup generation that were approved in PJM market to participate, and some 20 megawatts of 5,000 small distributed batteries that were bid into ISO New England's capacity market and delivered energy and capacity during a summer peak in 2022. There's also another example in ERCOT that you see that the sizes of these DERs are rather small, and this is responsive to just the plethora of challenges and barriers that these resources face when trying to bring those small customer DERs up into a wholesale market that has levels of load and generation that are 1,000 times larger than what they can contribute. Next slide. This is where FERC Order 2222 comes. It's addressing a number of barriers and requiring a number of changes in markets to allow DERs to be integrated more seamlessly under the expectation that if these DERs were integrated more efficiently into markets, that will lead to general benefits of making the market more efficient and more competitive. These requirements of FERC Order 2222 are generally separated in need for integrated DERs, market access for aggregators, so entities that are able to connect with customers, collect a number of them into a single program or offer, and then turn to the wholesale market and try to sell it there. It's requiring coordination between different entities, namely RTOs, ISOs, these aggregators, and the distribution utilities that are running the local grids to ensure that things remain reliable and there's avoidance of double counting. And there's barriers to be removed that the ISOs have to implement as well. And the next slide is going to show just a very broad overview of how these different requirements for FERC Order 2222 are being implemented by these 6 ISOs. I'm not going to walk through what's going on. This is actually something to consume slowly. I just wanted for you to focus on the blue shaded areas show the areas or the portions of implementation that are not getting compliance. And so there are indeed some ISOs that are having a lot of trouble to comply with FERC Order 2222, which attests into many extents to the challenges of performing this in real life and the challenges of bringing distributed resources to actually bid actively in wholesale markets and be included there. And some of these in the next slide, there's 4 of them that this team identified as key implementation challenges that needed to be addressed. One is the double counting. When you're bringing these DERs, many of them are responsive to distribution system level ratepayer funded programs. They have local benefits, local incentives that they're leveraging. And in theory, they can't respond to those and to the wholesale market at the same time. They will get double compensation for the same service. So this is something that has to be resolved, understand the overlaps and separate them. The distribution company also needs to be brought in much more actively. And distribution companies have largely been not really part of ISO world. And now they have to be playing a much more active role. One of the key roles is down here, metering and telemetry. DER aggregations require a lot of detailed measurement and telemetry to bring them actively into the dispatch of the wholesale markets. This is a whole set of infrastructure challenges that are required. And then finally, the newness of all this process and the need for RTOs to coordinate with for data collection to bring these DERs into their dispatch and to potentially apply performance penalties and other types of performance measurements that they have for market participants, requiring, again, another set of new challenges that are making it complex to be solved and to keep moving FERC Order 2222 forward. I believe this is my last slide. I'll be happy to focus on some questions in the remaining few minutes.
Great, thanks, JP. We have a couple. One, do you know of any studies that are focused on demand response programs for utilities with limited, advanced metering or maybe no advanced metering, so they can't, really do time-varying pricing? I'm assuming these would need to be treated more as a load reduction resource at the distribution level rather than a price-based capacity resource.
I think, yeah, that's a good question. I don't know of any off the top of my head. I don't know if there's any that has been developed. What I do know is that AMI, the business case for AMI was largely focused on operational benefits, operational cost reductions from the utility in billing and in meter readers, and potentially in responsiveness of their crews, because you can now identify outages much more accurately in your service territory. And so I don't remember seeing cases where the potential deployment of new rates was part of a business case for AMI. So there is a limitation there from the start point. But I think the logic here makes sense. And unfortunately, haven't seen. I don't think time of use can be deployed unless you have 2 meters. It can be deployed in a regular volumetric fashion, and so whether they can be brought up,
I think we could broaden this to, like other demand response programs, instead of pricing, there are lots of studies on other demand response programs like utility direct load control, curtailable tariffs, for large customers or irrigation customers. And the results of those studies are, baked into estimates of savings in the market potential studies that you talked about, JP.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, ultimately, I don't think it's a technology limitation. It's really the tension between rate-based capital, and relying on these non-wire solutions. That is, I think, driving whether this is a load reduction versus this is a competitive price-based or cost-based resource that's being considered.
Right. The suite of demand response programs, spans and non-wires alternatives, just spans, beyond pricing to include programs and procurements for DERs, which we talked about today and yesterday, actually. One more question, and then I don't know, Marty, if you want to take a break before we go to the skills session on stakeholder engagement, so you can chime in. But here's just one more question, JP. You mentioned distributed resources and wholesale markets are primarily managed by demand response aggregators. So here's an example. So you have, let's say, you've got an entity that's managing, multiple demand response units across, a bunch of customers, and they're executing demand, response strategy for those customers. And I think this is about like who is actually, who's doing what, like in terms of bidding in the market and winning the bid, and actually executing the transactions when called upon by the market operator. So can you get a little bit into who in that, the players, the roles?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I have a good answer because I'm not entirely familiar on how FERC 2222 has been implemented, but it's true that more than demand response aggregators is DER aggregators. They can aggregate anything that's at the distribution system level, and they are in charge of offering those resources as capacity resources into the market or energy resources. They can decide in which market they offer it. So this entity X is in charge of both bidding a certain amount that they deem credible and then looking for that amount back into their customer base and minimizing the difference between both, because what can lead to penalties. So I think in general, demand aggregators are being cautious, and if they have a base of say 300 megawatts, they're going to bid maybe 200 because they want to make sure that they have enough to cover their bases as they go up. But it's on them to deliver, as it is with any market participant that commits to deliver certain resources, and it's on them to deliver the resources. And so most of the risk falls on them. But that's essentially that's the role that aggregators are playing here, and is the emerging new role that exists.
Right. In other words, you don't have to go through the utility. These DER aggregators, which are other, private companies, they have full access to the market under these rules. All right, well, JP, thank you so much. That was great. Marty, would you like to do a short break before we go to the skills session with Jasmine on stakeholder engagement?